Hello again, students, and welcome to the second half of Module 2, the music of Cuba. In this case, the music leading up to 1959 and Cuba's revolution. We started the module talking about music of African origin, in particular folk music traditions. And we ended that part with rumba, which is one of the most important of the secular forms of folklore. These four, rumba, danzón, trova, and son, are considered by many musicologists to be the main ancestors of Cuban popular music. I like to call them the Big Four. So since we've already talked about rumba, we're going to talk about danzón, trova, and son. The danzón is Cuba's national dance. It was developed in 1879, but its roots go back to the 1700s in Western Europe in places like England and France. Over the years, it started to evolve, and as these styles of music became popular in Cuba, they began to become more mixed with different influences. So while it may have been a very European ancestor music, eventually you start to hear African influences coming in and changing the music. The main instrumentation used to play the danzón and all of its descendants is called the orquesta típica, which in Spanish just means traditional orchestra. Now, instrumentation is a word you're going to hear me say a lot. It just means what instruments are used to play in a band. Eventually, the kind of instrumentation used to play the danzón is going to be a charanga orchestra, and we'll see a little bit of that in a bit. Meanwhile, here's an orquesta típica. This is a traditional style of orchestra that would be used to play the danzón really up until the 1930s. Look at these instruments. They look mostly like Western European classical instruments, right? You have the double bass on the left, you have a clarinet, a couple of trumpets, some violins. But on the right of your screen, you see a couple of instruments. One might look familiar. The big, large drum is called a timpani. And that, of course, that drum developed in Western European classical music over the centuries. But on the far right, you see a gourd scraper being held by one of the musicians called a güiro. That's an indigenous instrument. So that's an example and an influence of the indigenous communities that left some of these instruments, of course, in Cuba. So you have European and indigenous instruments together. But what do you notice about the musicians? With the exception of the bass player, they're all of African descent. So this is the perfect example of the cultural blending that took place in Cuba. We're going to listen now to the very first danzón ever composed, just a fragment of it. It's called Las Alturas de Simpson, and it was composed in 1879. So the danzón was really important because the way it was structured enabled people who would come to hear that as an opportunity for them to change partners. So what do I mean by that? Well, this was a courtship dance, and this was an opportunity for people of the elite class to get together in a very formal, chaperoned environment. And because they were used to dancing to live music, they would pay attention to the music, and when the music would give a certain signal, they would change partners. This enabled people to change partners multiple times within the same song. We refer to this structure as ritornello. It's an Italian word that just refers to one part of the music that keeps returning. It keeps coming back. So if you see on the screen, I've highlighted the letter A in yellow. That is the section of the song called the paseo. That's the introduction of the song that keeps coming back multiple times, thereby enabling the dancers to change partners so that they can meet one another. So this was like a formalized way of dating in the upper class elite at the time. One of the things that happens during that part of the music is that the drum, the timpani drum, makes this really loud 5-note rhythm played sort of consistently. It's called a cinquillo, and cinco in Spanish means 5, so it's like a 5-note rhythm that repeats over and over again. That's a signal. That's a clue. It's time to change partners. Eventually, the danzón would add different parts. There would be a repetitive section at the end for improvisation. But meanwhile, one of the most interesting things, transformations to happen in this orchestra, is that they get rid of a lot of the horns, and the timpani drum gives way to the timbales, which is the drum you see there. It became one of the most significant instruments in all of Latin percussion. So you also have a softening or a sweetening of the instrumentation with flute and violins and the piano, as well as the double bass and the güiro. So eventually the timpani gave way to the timbales, and by the 1930s you add one conga drum. So now we're going to listen to a danzón played by a charanga orchestra. This is a beautiful composition from 1936 called Angoa. I encourage you, of course, to listen to the entire song. You're only going to have little short clips here. One of the most important musicians in the history of Cuba's popular music during the early part of the 20th century was actually a bassist and composer. His name was Israel Lopez Cachao. He and his brother Orestes were part of that orchestra you just heard. And as they started experimenting with a danzón, they started adding elements of improvisation. They added a new section at the end of the danzón called Nuevo Ritmo, which in Spanish means new rhythm. And this enabled the musicians to take solos. It was something that was very freeing, very liberating. And the very first piece of music that they composed that had this new section in it was composed in 1938, and it was called Mambo. You might say, that kind of sounded like salsa music. Well, actually, salsa sounds like that because the influence that was so strong that was coming into the music was actually coming from the son, as we'll talk about at the end of this slide presentation. Moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about trova. Trovar in Spanish means to tell a story, and a troubadour or trovador is somebody who sings a story. This has, of course, Spanish origins in the country music. And as that music came into Cuba and other parts of the Spanish-speaking world, we start to see the celebration of a lot of different forms of poetry, including the decima, which is a very complex form of poetry. The main instrument you'll hear in trova music is the guitar and lots of relatives of the guitar. And the focus is on the lyrics. You know, trova songs could be romantic, they could be patriotic, it could be one person singing, they could be multiple people singing in duos or trios. And some of the most important styles that developed within the genre of trova are the bolero, the canción, the guajira, the punto guajiro, and others. Many of these troubadours created songs that are still popular today. Some of these trova songs have been around for over 100 years, and people in Cuba are still singing them. And one of the greatest was composed by a trovadora by the name of Maria Teresa Vera. When she was about 15 years old, she wrote this very heartbreaking song called Veinte Años. It's a song about a breakup.
¿Qué te importa que te ame si tú no me quieres ya? El amor que ya ha pasado no se debe recordar. Fui la ilusión de tu vida un día lejano ya. Hoy represento el pasado, no me puedo conformar.
Beautiful song, sung in harmony. So two people singing together in harmony with guitars playing this very simple rhythm. And this is an example of one of the most enduring songs, again, written nearly 100 years ago and still being sung today. Here's a clip from a wonderful documentary featuring the great singer Omara Portuondo. Here she is, probably in her 70s. She's now, I think, about 85 years old. This is her walking through the streets of Old Havana, singing the song by herself and her adoring fans following her. And eventually the scene goes to a performance at Carnegie Hall with the Buena Vista Social Club, one of the most popular organizations, if you will, of musicians to come together and record classic Cuban music. in the 90s. So this is a little bit of a clip from that documentary.
¿Qué te importa que te ame si tú no me quieres ya? El amor que ya ha pasado no se debe recordar. Fui la ilusión de tu vida, un día lejano ya. Hoy represento el pasado, no me puedo conformar. Si las cosas que uno quiere se pudieran alcanzar, tú me quisieras lo mismo que 20 años atrás. Con qué tristeza miramos a un amor que se nos va. Es un pedazo del alma que se arranca sin piedad. Es un pedazo del alma que se arranca sin piedad.
It is such a beautiful song. And again, people are still singing it today. Probably one of the greatest trova songs in the world, fell in love with is a song called Guajira Guantanamera. The songs, the lyrics were composed originally, the poetry was based on the poetry of Jose Marti, and a singer by the name of Joseito Fernandez took those poems and he created a verse and a chorus that he added. And so the combination of Jose Marti's poetry with Joseito Fernandez, his inspiration really led to this beautiful song that has been recorded and performed the world over many, many, many times. And it's a song about patriotism. It's a song about understanding the sense of Cubanness and what it means to be Cuban. I'm sure you've heard that song before. It's such a beautiful song, a very enduring song. So you have, again, of the big four, you have rumba, you have danzón, you have trova, and finally you have son, which is the grandfather of salsa. Now, what does that mean? It means that all the ingredients in the son are present in salsa music. It means that salsa music evolved from the son and many other influences, but that the foundations came from Cuba. And what is the son? It's an equal mix of African and Spanish melodies and rhythms. It's very syncopated. It's dance music. It has a lot of improvisation. It has call and response singing, and it has repetition in it. It developed in the late 1800s in the eastern part of Cuba with an early style called the changui that used many simple instruments, including the Cuban tres guitar, which is a smaller shaped guitar, the bongos, which are the two small drums you see there. They're actually attached together. A metal scraper called a guayo, the maracas, and then that box with those metal tongues on it is called the marimbula. This is a West African, specifically Congolese instrument that is used throughout the Caribbean and parts of South America. You see on the right somebody is sitting on top of the marimbula plucking those metal tongues. It's used to play the bass. So this very early instrumentation of son music was from the mountains, right? This was country music. And this is an example of the sound of the changui. And even though it's an old style of music that goes back to the 1800s, guess what? People are still playing it today. This is a group called Las Mujeres del Changui. So you hear all of those Africanisms in there: call and response, repetition, syncopation, polyrhythm, and improvisation. And so this old style of the son, called the changui, would eventually become more modernized. By the 19 teens and 20s, a couple of really important things happened. First of all, that music was from the countryside, right, from up in the mountains. Well, the musicians started to come into the cities looking for work, and they started to blend different instruments, and you start to see this new instrumentation established called the sexteto, which in Spanish just means the sextet. In the center of the picture, you see a double bass, a classical instrument, right, used in Western European classical music. You have the bongos on the left. You have a musician holding a pair of claves. And you also have on the right two different guitars, a regular Spanish six-string guitar and the Cuban tres. Tres means three in Spanish, and it's three sets of double strings that's played with a pick. So that's what makes the tres guitar so distinct. And this is the kind of music that would have been recorded for the very first time in Cuba in the 1920s, really in the 19 teens and 20s. Some of the very first recordings made of Cuban music were of this style of the son. Here is La Loma de Belén. So you might have noticed the sound of the claves, that very high-pitched wooden sound. That is a very significant contribution, if you will, to Cuban music. The sound of the claves kind of cut through like a knife and became one of the most representative aspects of Cuban music as it started to get recorded and performed around the world. The next instrumentation to develop would be the septeto, the septet. They would just add one trumpet to these smaller groups. And you'll notice, again, guitars, percussion, and voice. And the string bass, the double bass. Here's an example from the very famous Septeto Nacional de Ignacio Piñero, Suavecito.
Carola, el son de altura, con sabrosura, bailando a solas.
And of course, the son would travel extensively during the 1920s as musicians would come to the United States and travel throughout Latin America, bringing the popularity of Cuban music to the world. Many of these musicians had great success, including Septeto Anacaona. There were 5 sisters and a cousin, and several other people eventually would join. But what made this group so extraordinary was that they were an all-female ensemble during a time when many women were not supported in this kind of context of popular music. But of course, as the men would go off to war and do other things, the women would keep people entertained at home and abroad. This particular photograph was taken on Broadway in New York City in the 1920s. And I'm going to play you an example of one of their sones called Se va el dulcerito.
Yo le voy a comprar la paneta y la borracha, el sabroso que sube, el coco acaramelado, ay como le gusta a usted.
So we'll hear a little bit more of the descendants of that group at the end of this slideshow. So what's very significant about the son is that this is music for dancing. But unlike the danzón, which is also a dance, the son is for everybody. Right? The danzón was kind of elitist. It was only for people of the upper class society. And in a very segregated society, that meant that while the musicians may have been Afro-Cuban, a mixed race, the audiences at that time were all white. when the son came along, the son was really for everybody, and the son continues to be for everybody. And this is one of the most classic sones ever composed, called Son de la Loma.
Mamá, yo quiero saber de dónde son los cantantes, que yo encuentro muy galantes y los quiero conocer con su trova fascinante, que me la quiero aprender.
It's beautiful music, it's joyful music, and again, this is music that's been around for a long time and is still celebrated in Cuba. Even though, of course, we're going to hear more modern versions of it and lots of different types of influences coming from far and wide, the son is still the foundation of almost everything we hear in Cuban music. And, of course, in salsa music. By the 1930s and 40s, people start to experiment with different instrumentations. And in the late 1930s, one of the great geniuses of Cuban music, Arsenio Rodriguez, a tres-player composer and band leader, developed a new instrumentation called the conjunto. The word conjunto in Spanish just means group, but specifically refers to a larger grouping where you add the piano, you add a conga drum, and you add more trumpets, and suddenly now you have maybe a 10-piece band, and it sounds a little bit bigger. They're still playing son music, or son montuno, which is, again, even more repetitive, but it's an example of the music that would really lay the groundwork for salsa later on. Lots of improvisation, lots of repetition, and there you had kind of a call and response between the trumpet and the singing, which is, again, a very important part of the African elements in the music. By the mid to late 40s, people wanted to speed things up a little bit, and so the son was still the foundational music, but people started to experiment with the tempo and making sure that the music was just a little bit faster. And we refer to this style of music called huaracha. The huaracha is usually the rhythm that is being played when you hear salsa music. A salsa musician has to play many different types of rhythms, but this is one of the main ones. And in Cuba, there was a great singer. She was known as La Huarachera de Cuba. Huarachar in Spanish means to enjoy, and one of the greatest singers in the history of Cuba was Celia Cruz. And this is her singing with the orchestra La Sonora Matancera. Incredible voice, and we'll talk, of course, more about Celia, and I encourage you to watch as many different videos of her as you can because she was an incredible performer. So a few things to kind of get us up to 1959 that are significant. One is that in the tradition of the danzón, you have people experimenting with that music and coming up with a very repetitive style that would eventually break away from the danzón and become its own genre, a style called the cha-cha-cha. And the story is really fascinating. It turns out that the musicians had come up with this more improvised kind of style of playing, and then the dancers decided to change their step. And when the musicians heard the dancers shuffling their feet on the floor, they came up with this term cha-cha-cha. That term was developed by Enrique Jorrin, who was a violinist, and eventually the cha-cha-cha became, of course, world famous. Here is one of the biggest cha-cha-cha hits from the mid-1950s called Rico Vacilón. again, that's a charanga orchestra. So when you hear a charanga orchestra, it's again a sweeter, softer sound. You have the flute, you have violins, piano, the conga drums, timbales, a güiro, and some singers. Here is a group called Orquesta Estrellas Cubanas, and you'll see a few dancers dancing to this live band.
Cubanas son para bailar, una guaracha, un buen danzón, muy rítmico cha-cha-cha. Tocororo, es hermoso el tocororo, tocororo, oriundo de mi país. Tocororo, es hermoso el tocororo, tocororo, oriundo de mi país. Tocororo. Ven a gozar conmigo, nena, este ritmo cha-cha-cha. Ven a gozar conmigo, nena, este ritmo cha-cha-cha.
Este rico cha-cha-cha, this tasty cha-cha-cha. So there you just saw some very small fragments of each of those important styles of music all together in one song. Probably one of the most significant things to happen in Cuba by the 1950s was the explosion in the popularity of the mambo. The very first time people heard the word mambo used in popular music was back in 1938, but a Cuban pianist by the name of Damaso Pérez Prado, that's him in the middle of your screen, he traveled to Mexico and developed a style of music that was very successful. He wrote many compositions and called them all mambos, and he appeared in many Mexican films. And he was one of the first Latino artists to have record sales in the millions. He's the one who put the word mambo on the map, and here is a little bit of his Mambo Number 5. Very popular, very repetitive, and that wonderful sound of saxophones and trumpets and trombones. These instruments that typically you would hear in a jazz band, suddenly you're starting to hear in Cuban music. And once we start talking about salsa and Latin jazz in New York, we're going to understand that that marriage between jazz and Cuban music is also very, very significant. Just a couple more slides on this presentation here. One of the greatest traditions of the trova is the bolero. It's a romantic ballad. Many composers of boleros from Latin America gave us pieces that are recorded and have been recorded for decades. And this is a repertoire of songs that are shared by many different Spanish-speaking countries. One of the great singers in the history of Cuban music, besides Celia Cruz, was Benny Moré. This is him singing a beautiful bolero called Como Fue.
¿Cómo fue? No sé decirte cómo fue, no sé explicarme qué pasó, pero de ti me enamoré.
That sound of like a jazz big band with Cuban percussion and this exquisite voice. This was really the sound of Cuban music in the 1950s. He was very much like the Frank Sinatra of Cuba. He actually played at the Oscars in the United States with his band once in the 50s. So again, a very important musician. Much like Celia Cruz for women, Benny Moré for men, he was the epitome of male singers. And finally, one of the most interesting things to come about by the end of the 1950s, right before the revolution, was a tradition called the descarga. Descargar in Cuban Spanish means to have a jam session. The idea that musicians don't really have a plan, they don't rehearse, they just get together and play whatever they feel like. It's very spontaneous, very improvisational. simple repeated bass line, and a conga solo with other percussion instruments. Eventually, somebody will make up a chorus, and then someone else will take a solo. I want to end this particular module with an incredible group. Earlier, I played the Septeto Anacaona from the 1920s and 30s. These are the daughters and granddaughters and nieces of some of those founding members. Orquesta Anacaona, which is a very popular group in Cuba today. This is them taking a very old song and making it modern. La Mulata Rumbera.
Vaya, oye, llegó la mulata rumbera. Conmigo, yo me vuelvo en Georgia. Ay, Dios mío. Soy la mulata rumbera, rumbera soy. Del barrio Jesús María, válgame Dios. Y cuando llego a la rumba, por Dios que alarmó el solar, rumbera.
I highly encourage you to watch that entire video on YouTube. It is amazing. And Module 3 is going to focus on music after Cuba's revolution. So it's important to understand something about the revolution and social change that happened. What were the new sounds that were coming? What happened with trova music? What about jazz? What about hip hop and rock and roll? These are all things that we're going to be looking at in Module 3. So until then, I'll see you next time.